It's nice to see all of you. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Brian DePoy, and I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Avila University, and want to welcome all of you. I want to express gratitude to Martha Malinsky for all the incredible work that she and her team have done this has been an incredible first day. Gone very, very well. Wonderful speakers, but Martha, thank you for your work behind the scenes. I do also want to express gratitude to some key members of the Avila University team, including I think 5 faculty volunteers as well as some IT help. So thank you, Avila friends, for helping make this successful. I have the wonderful privilege of introducing one of the outstanding leaders we have at Avila University, and that is Leslie Dorrough Smith. And it is my privilege to welcome her and introduce her to you. She's a scholar and really an amazing leader who brings intellectual rigor, deep empathy, and moral clarity to some really complex issues, not only at Avila University, but also in higher education and society. She currently serves as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and she's a professor of religious studies and women's and gender studies at Avila. Her research, which explores the intersections of American evangelism, gender, race, and politics, is widely published and highly respected. Among her recent works are Compromising Positions, Sex Scandals, Politics, and American Christianity, and the forthcoming Religions of the World, Questions, Challenges, and New Directions. Beyond her scholarship, she's leading a campus-wide initiative right now, which is a book club, which is grounded in the theme of dignity. That's really become very, very popular at Avila. The whole point of this dialogue and initiative is to invite the entire university community into courageous and transformative conversations. And that has really, I think, in many ways transformed the way we interact with one another at Avila. Dr. Smith leads with great empathy and with a strong sense of relational accountability, modeling what it means to speak truthfully while also listening deeply. In her everyday leadership, I personally witnessed her efforts to implement the charisms of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, a commitment to unity, inclusive love of the dear neighbor, and a bold willingness to engage in dialogue that fosters healing and justice. It is with admiration and gratitude that I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Leslie Dorrough Smith. Dr. Smith?
Oh my, thank you. Such accolades. Thank you so much, Brian. That was really, really kind. So this particular presentation, I think many of you will find it to be perhaps a nuts and bolts version of some of the things that we've heard up to this point. And I wanted to give you a sense of where this presentation came from and what some of the tensions were that helped to inspire it. One of the things that I like to say is that I only teach subjects that make people mad. I'm a professor of religious studies, so I teach a lot of classes about religion, and in particular, I'm a sociologist of religion. And then I teach gender studies. So there is always something in the courses that I'm teaching that has the potential to inspire conflict or to also to be, I think, liberating and revelatory, but definitely I'm always wary of the conflict. So across the course of my faculty career, I made friends with a colleague who was at Avila, and in fact, I think she just left us about a year ago. And one of the interesting things that she and I were discussing one day was how frequently many of the strategies that I use in the classroom in order to help mitigate conflict and to help navigate some of the difficult conversations that sometimes emerge in the disciplines that I represent, that those techniques were very similar to the same techniques that she was using when in the past several years she was teaching about religious history under Putin's Russia. And so as we begin, it's obviously not something that, not a point of commonality that you often have with other peers, but as we were beginning to have this discussion about how we navigated these difficult concepts, how we were able to talk about really important ethical principles and not to water them down, but to still speak about them in a way that was as non-threatening as possible. Various parts of this presentation emerged. So what I hope, again, is is one of the things that will, excuse me, emerge from this is that we will be able to perhaps instrumentalize some of the discussions that we've been having up to this point. And can someone confirm for me that you can see some PowerPoints now? Excellent. Okay. Okay. Fabulous. So, friends, one of the things that I put in the chat already is a reference to this book. Everyone at Avila is probably rolling their eyes because I talk about it so much. A book by Donna Hicks called Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflict. And the reason I want to bring that out is because as we are talking about love, we're talking about our charism. I believe that this particular book does an excellent job in helping us define what love is. I want to tap into some of the things that were mentioned a little bit earlier by some of my colleagues who've already spoken about how, when we talk about love, we are not talking about, we are not talking about a pep rally. We're not talking about building emotions with each other and in the classroom that are just designed to make us feel good or that are just designed to make a group of people feel, let's say, connected to each other. We are talking about a very specific kind of recognition of the wholeness of humans that requires very careful planning for those of us in leadership positions and for those of us who are navigating difficult classroom discussions. So what I would like to do during the course of this presentation is, again, just share some tips with you that I have developed across the 25-ish years that I've been teaching. All of these controversial topics, but at the same time, I think that there are so many applications outside of the classroom as well, in terms of how we lead, in terms of how we relate to each other, in terms of many of the campus dynamics that we were just talking about with Mary's excellent presentation. So one of the first principles that I want to focus on is that if we hope to foster communities that are committed to unifying love, and to borrow the language of Donna Hicks, let me say that when I mean unifying love, I'm talking about communities that acknowledge the inherent worth of all people and that hope to create conditions for their flourishing. That's just, kind of my riff on Donna Hicks' definition of dignity, actually. But I think that these terms mean very similar types of things when we talk about dignity and love. The sorts of relationships that I have with the faculty at Avila, they're not going to be perhaps the sort of squishy love that I feel for my kids, right? But that love that we're talking about in this context that Mary described as agape is something that I also find a lot of resonance with this term dignity. That it is my goal as a leader, as a professor, as a teacher, as a guide, to acknowledge the worth of the people that I teach, that I lead, and to do as much as possible everything I can to create the conditions for their flourishing. If you're a person with a background in ethics, you're familiar with the ethics of care. There are some similar types of themes that really tap into to ethics of care language. So one of the things that I found out a long time ago, whenever I began to teach about some of these uncomfortable topics, was that I had to plan ahead. I am a control freak. I really enjoy things organized in a very specific sort of way. And so one of the things that I began to find in the context of my classroom was that when I began to think about the students that I was teaching as emotional beings on a journey, I began to completely overhaul the way that I taught. If you have any background in conflict resolution techniques or restorative justice, restorative relationships, you will know that thinking about, and we might just describe this as empathy, but thinking empathically about the experiences of those that we teach, that we serve, that we lead is critical to having these types of discussions. And the type of planning that I have spent so much time doing is really about lowering the fear of students and also lowering the fear of those in other circumstances that I lead. Because if we are engaged with people and the way that we relate to them heightens their fear, then they will not have the capacity to hear what we say. I'll talk in just a moment about some of the common things that I hear in response to that. I think there are a lot of people, particularly when we're teaching students, who may frustrate us with some of the things that they say that we believe are unethical or that they are unjust. That there can be the tendency to think that we should, in fact, perhaps we even have the moral obligation to speak forthrightly to them in a way that we feel will demonstrate the strength of our message, but in a practical sense, what it often will do is to undermine the message entirely. So let me say again, and forgive my text-heavy slides. I intend these actually as a resource for you, hopefully after the fact, and I'm quite happy to share them. So that's why they might have just a few more words on them than is probably advisable. But no matter how right you are, people will not hear you if they feel threatened. And so I want to, mention here these four factors that you can control in the classroom. I will, by the way, across the course of this presentation, speak about some examples from the classroom that were real teaching moments for me about what I could and could not control. But again, I want to also reiterate that these are methods that have a lot of weight and a lot of purpose outside of the classroom context. So here are the factors that you can often control when having difficult discussions with students, with colleagues, with others. First of all, you can control what your objective is. And we will talk a little bit more about how important it is in difficult conversations to understand the actual clarity of your objective. A brief spoiler alert is that sometimes I think in the classroom in particular, when we're talking about thorny ethical issues, it can feel important to be right when there are actually really important critical thinking goals that are really quite fundamental to the student experience. And if we can help the student to meet those critical thinking goals, they will naturally come along to see some more and different perspectives, or that is often the case. A second factor that you can control is a very carefully tailored message. Some of you might be familiar with the Buddhist concept of skillful means. Brian was mentioning that my most recent book is actually a textbook. This was my very first textbook. I like to say that it was as fun to write a textbook as it is to read one. So I have learned many, many things. But skillful means is a Buddhist concept. It was a world religions textbook. It's a Buddhist concept that basically says that there is wisdom in tapering your message to your audience. In other words, not all audiences are ready to hear the whole shebang at once. And that if you want to teach someone something, then it's very important that you carefully think about how much of the message they are able to digest. That's an extremely important principle, I believe, when we're talking about thorny or difficult conversations in the classroom. It's also, like a pop culture parallel for those of us, who are over 40 is, Jack Nicholson, you can't handle the truth. This is sort of the Buddhist version of that. And then some of you are probably familiar with this concept of backlash effect. I see this a lot in my classrooms. Backlash effect is when you insist and provide evidence to someone, let's say very hard objective evidence, that a core belief or that a really important belief to them is wrong. Rather than change people's minds, backlash effect is the phenomenon wherein they tend to resist that information even more and tend to stick even more mightily to the position that they had before. So you can be clear on what your goal is educationally. And again, this works both in the classroom and outside of it as well. You can very carefully tailor your message, thinking about who you are speaking to, what type of information they need to hear, and how much of it is appropriate, based on their knowledge level and also their emotional capacity. You can also control your own baggage. I think this is probably one of the most difficult areas for us to really consider. I thought that our last presentation really got at that beautifully. In fact, both Anne and Mary's presentations mentioned the fact that there are certain types of personal experiences that we might have, certain types of emotions that we might experience. And because of our roles, because of the place that we hold at our institutions, it's not always appropriate to share those feelings because those particular feelings might hijack the larger aims. And so being very clear on what we're attempting to achieve, and also about how, quite frankly, feelings of moral righteousness will sometimes hijack our ability to be wise in the classroom. And those are really important things to keep check on. And then finally, your demeanor. Near the end of this conversation, we're going to talk about some very practical things that you can do to help set up a situation or a conversation where you are actively using preemptive de-escalation techniques so that hopefully the conversation does not go to a place where it goes off the rails. All right. Let me see if I can go forward. Okay, so technique number 1. Establish guidelines for, and I use the word everyone here intentionally, everyone. When I begin a class that has a thorny subject at its heart, and the example that I'm going to use for the next couple of techniques is my PL 326 class. So even though I'm doing a lot less teaching in the dean role now, this is a class that I still hold on to. It's really, really close to my heart. Those of you who are at APP know that this is my feminist theory and practice class, and as part of our community engagement component to this class, we go and spend some time at a local halfway house for women. And this halfway house was founded by the sisters and is part of a program that the sisters continue to guide. And so the very name of the class, right? It has the word feminist in the title. It brings some students to the class that are a little bit unsure about what we're going to do together. And I, in fact, opened the first day of the class with an invitation to the students to share, not necessarily, I mean, we get to what they thought the class might be about, but I ask them often first what their family thought the class was going to be about. And we get some interesting discussion as we talk about this. So on that first day of that class that has the potential to be so thorny, I have a very clear syllabus statement that that we read together. I'll share that syllabus statement with you in just a moment, but I make certain with them that they understand that that is an expectation of behavior for me and them. And so I situate myself as a person in the community of learning so that they understand that we're all in it together. I also take a lot of time to talk about why we should talk about controversial subjects in the first place. I also spend some time modeling for them what appropriate and inappropriate engagement in the class would look like. For instance, I might start off with a really, a really easy example where I say something like, I think LGBTQ people are stupid, right? That is not an appropriate way to engage this particular topic. We talk about how no matter how one personally feels about a topic, that using demeaning words, even in jest, is not appropriate. And then we do talk about how to answer or to ask a question about something that's really sensitive. So if I don't know, for instance, in a class, what it means to be trans, let's say, or if I'm not familiar, if I'm a student and, I don't know, TikTok told me one thing and now my gender studies professor is telling me another, how can I ask that in a way where I can honestly get an answer? And so we also discuss, the difference between asking with earnest curiosity, knowing that there might be a moment for learning, and asking in a way that we know might cause harm or offense because it knowingly disrespects or violates the dignity of the other people in the class. I also do use some of the principles of this dignity book that I put into the chat. I have like a 1 or 2 pager. It actually, there's a stack of them that sit in the corner of my desk. I might give them out a little too often, but I have all of my students take one of those handouts so that they can get a sense of these basic virtues that we need to experience as humans in order to feel like our worth has been recognized. And those include things like safety, acknowledgement, independence, accountability, giving others the benefit of the doubt, and a whole list of other types of virtues just like that. Now, number three is probably one of the most important things that I think I do that is perhaps a little different from just the normal, hey, everyone, let's remember to speak respectfully of each other. And that is that I remind the audience of the audience. And what I mean by that is that I start off the first day in all of my classes reminding the students that they have no clue who the other people in the room are, that they will be surrounded by people who come from a different racial or ethnic group, that they will be surrounded by people who have a different gender identity than they presently hold, that they will be surrounded by people who have had different life experiences, that they will be surrounded by people with different sexual orientations, that they, for our class, I've also started to incorporate another element, which is you are almost certainly surrounded by people who have parents who have been incarcerated. And so those types of things are actually a really important thing that I want to remind the students about, because when we're talking about sensitive subjects, it becomes very easy for a student to say, well, all fill in the blanks, name the group. I've heard that they like this. And if we can stop and remind ourselves that, in fact, our room is made up of diverse groups of people, we should never call on anyone to represent a group or an identity marker, right? Because that can really put folks on the line. Sorry for this particular beeping. I'm going to have to figure out what the beeping is coming from my office. Anyway, and then finally, I really think that there's something important about clarifying your educational aims with humility. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Having spent, again, decades doing difficult work related to ethics, it can be very hard to have a student who says things in their papers and on their exams that you find ethically problematic, but they have nevertheless met the educational objectives of the course. I think probably I had a different approach at one point in time where I was really convinced that I would convince them of the moral perfection of my own position. And then when I began to study ethics, in a much more complex way, I've got a saying that I throw around often whenever I teach ethics courses, and that is, if it's easy, it's not ethics. It is very rare to find ethicists who uniformly agree on anything at all. And so I think it's really important to understand, back to the topic of an emotional journey, that when we are having difficult conversations with students, we are on a journey with them. They are not going to move from point A to point B with the same speed that if we're at point B, they're not going to join us the next day. Also, I think to some degree, we've got to have some humility that point B may not be where we always want to end up ourselves, and that sometimes it feels like we need to take moral positions that really aren't necessary in light of what we're teaching. And I think in particular, the more that students feel threatened by the things that we might say or our approach to them, if students, frequently talk about a professor seeming condescending, if they talk about a professor who seems to sort of shut down conversation or to be defensive, then nothing that we say will get through. And so the only thing that we will have to win at the end is a sense of moral righteousness, right? And so I think that if we're really using unifying love, that building of community that actively acknowledges the worth of all people, if that's our goal, then we've got to really stop and think about whether our feelings of moral righteousness might, in some cases, hijack our aims, or at least to be very strategic about how we do that. So this is a very text-heavy slide. Again, I've included this here because I thought that it might be helpful as an example for a later resource. I've listed here a portion of the syllabus statement that I provide and that I use throughout the entire semester in my feminist theory and practice class. And let me just read a portion of it so that you can get a sense for how I frame the conversation. I return to this many times a semester. I'll open up the syllabus, go back to this particular place when I find that we might need a reminder. We will discuss a wide variety of topics in this class, some of which will be controversial and for some of you perhaps uncomfortable. I do not promise a safe space in the sense that you will be shielded from topics that might make you uncomfortable, but I will strongly attempt to create a respectful space that promotes human dignity and facilitates ethical and humane learning. Rather than avoid painful conversations, the feminist movement in all of its manifestations has historically sought to confront both controversy and discomfort in the hopes of overcoming the conflicts that create them. We have the same goal in this class: to speak openly, honestly, and respectfully with one another about these issues. So that's an example of a statement, like I said, that I use frequently in some of my classes where more thorny subjects come up. And generally speaking, students respond really well to that. So the second technique that I learned the hard way, I'll tell you a little bit of background about this, is to let the CSJ values do the work for you. And this is something that I now do all the time. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened in religion and U.S. politics in the spring of 2021. Well, that is a semester I cried a lot. There's one thing that happened. 2021, that was right after the November election between Trump and Biden. And so we were deep in the midst of COVID. We were still having classes online. And we had just had this extremely contentious political contest. So we headed into January, the coldest and darkest of months in my book. And we were starting this class that I had never taught before in an online context, religion and US politics. And despite the fact that I felt like I had taken great lengths to acknowledge the diversity of religious groups, that I had taken great lengths to acknowledge a variety of different positions that religious groups had taken. At the end of that particular time, I received course evaluations. They weren't bad. I was not pleased with them, though. I had students saying things that I had never seen on evaluations before. And they, were saying things like, she hates Christians, which was mind-blowing to me, but nevertheless, somehow that was the emotion that had come across. And as I began to really think about why it was that students began to have this reflection or to have this reaction to the material that I had taught, this despite the fact that I had taken great pains to make sure that all of these different things were representative, that I had been extraordinarily neutral in my description of religious groups and political groups, they still came away with that impression, or at least enough of them did that I was bothered. The more that I looked through those evaluations, though, one of the things that became clear to me was that the students in this time of incredible polarization and struggle didn't really have any sort of context through which to digest this new information where they could also feel safe. So anything at all that felt new in this time of huge cultural polarization, anything that felt new was going to feel threatening, was going to feel like it was shaking at their foundations. And so the next time that I did the class, one of the things that I did was I began with a conversation about what it means to be a faith-based institution. And we talked a lot about the stereotypes of a faith-based institution, about how, often faith-based, we associate it with a very specific version, often of Protestant Christianity. And then we went to the CSJ website, and we talked about what it might mean to be faith-based in a different way, and how our institution's values were going to guide what we learned, and that we could even use the values of the sisters and some of their concerns to think about religion in US politics. The next time I taught it was an absolute revolution. It was a totally different experience. And I think it's because that instability that they were feeling, again, coming right off of that 2020 election, they just felt like anything that was new or that was the least bit different, perhaps, than what they had been previously told was jarring. And so when I gave them something to grab onto institutionally, that made it safe. So I wanted to show you quickly a couple of different things that I did for two different classes that I taught that semester. This is the feminist theory class. I created an objective, and this is just an example of how the CSJ values, how I've tried to put them into service. So I made a learning objective that specifically is about the CSJ values. And so one objective for that class is that I will address the relationship between feminist inquiry and the CSJ values as it relates to a particular population, in this case, incarcerated women, because that's the case study for the particular class. And the outcome that matches that is that students will reflect on an individual's responsibility to their local, national, or global community and their capacity to create change at the intersection of the core subject matter and reciprocal service to the dear neighbor. So that also gives us the ability to talk a little bit about the dear neighbor, about who they are, and about how our institutional values can guide what we do. This next example is what I ended up doing with that thorny religion and US politics course. I ended up redoing the final assignment and I decided to make a final paper that was about social polarization. I just decided to hit it head on. And so not only did I create a unit where we discuss the dynamics, psychological, social, of polarization, what causes people to polarize? Is polarization logical? Is polarization ethical? So we hit that one head on. And then in the final paper, I asked them to talk about how us versus them rhetoric had changed across time for a particular group or a particular issue. There was enough historical content in that course that students could chart how at one point in time, these political groups were using religious language to fight about this. And then later on, they were using the same language, but they were fighting about something different. So I wanted them to understand and have some historical context through which to digest that us versus them rhetoric. And then in that same paper, I asked them to imagine how a CSJ approach might have changed the dynamic, or what type of CSJ related value they thought would have been a remedy to the ethical crisis at hand. So those were just a brief example of some changes that I made that again made all the difference. But a lot of it was just me recognizing that I already had a tool at my disposal that I wasn't using, and that was the CSJ values. All right. This is a tough one. Actually, it kind of seems like it shouldn't be the tough one. It should seem like it's the obvious one, but this is where some of that backlash effect comes in. In this third technique, I spend a lot of time in the classroom emphasizing the importance of objective analysis, solid argumentation, and facts. Now, one of the reasons that I do that is because there are very few people who are going to say, I hate objective facts. Right now, that doesn't mean that people actually, alter their lives in line with objective facts, but at least as a point of buying into the type of topics that I teach whenever things are pretty thorny, I will very frequently say, hey, our approach is going to be as objective as possible. We are not here to adjudicate truth. We are simply here to discuss using, kind of a neutral, detached mode of observation, how these dynamics work out. That's something I almost always say in religious studies classes. Unlike the field of theology, I've been trained in religious studies, which is the sociological, historical, critical study of religion or of religious people. So I make it very clear to them that what I'm saying does not require any sort of religious buy-in, that my goal is not to make them more or less religious by the time that we're done with the class. And that seems to really resonate with a lot of students who I think can feel threatened by the sense that that I have an agenda and that I'm somehow out to get them. But on the other hand, one of the things that I'm very, very keen on in most of the classes that I teach is discussing this idea very forthrightly that everyone's opinion is valid. So this conversation usually goes like this. I say, hey, have you all heard the idea that everyone's opinion is valid? And almost everyone in the class does this. And I'll say, what do you think about that? And they're like, yeah. And then they see someone shake, nod their head and they sort of stop. And there's almost always someone who says, wait a minute, what if they have a really bad opinion? But it takes a while for them to get there. I know that to us that might seem like common sense, but this is probably one of the most common tropes that I see students invoke on written assignments in ethics, gender studies, and religious studies courses. So I often use sort of worst case scenarios. I look at some of the worst warmongers, some of the people who have committed the most evil in the world. And I say, so are we okay with saying everyone's opinion is valid? And of course, at that moment, students will say, well, no, okay, not that one. And so we spend some time to really dismantle where that idea comes from. We talk about how that idea is often intended to create a sense of perhaps unstable peacemaking or to kind of put a band-aid over some dilemmas, but that it doesn't actually solve problems. If we want, to really look at it in a more intense way, if we want to really dissect a problem, this idea doesn't do very much for us. And so after we establish that foundation, I reinforce how important objectivity is. And we define objectivity as some sort of predictably causal basis that we can turn to. There are occasionally students who push back against this particular notion or this definition, but most of them understand and I think yearn for something that feels stable, that they can trust. And so, particularly in my ethics classes, I spend time talking about what a logical and an objective argument might look like. And so, that is actually commonly, for those of you who may teach ethics, that's a pretty typical part of critical reasoning, or actually, it's the total, a sum total of critical reasoning classes. It's a strong feature of a lot of ethics classes. But I also point out to them that just because we take some objective facts and we put some logic together with it doesn't mean that the result is something that's ethical. So if I say, yeah, we should kill off part of the population because then there's more food for the rest of us, that might be very logical and it might be objectively true, but that doesn't make it ethical. So we experiment a little bit with some of these arguments about non-threatening topics so that when it's time to take hold of the threatening topics, it's not so much shock all at once. We've already begun to exercise some of these logical tools. I also am very intent on rejecting the polarization impulse, both for me and the students. It can be very easy, as I mentioned earlier, to feel like you need to say, this is the right position. But again, our goal, I hope, is to teach a series of critical thinking skills and to also discuss the necessity of ethical and empathic thinking. And so if I were to portray the world as simply a bunch of rights and wrongs, then that black and white approach is really only going to further trouble the critical thinking problem that I'm really trying to overcome in the classroom, which is that I'm trying to increase nuance. I also make sure that I am grading for objective standards, objective examples of critical thinking, and that I am not grading for ideological conformity, which is something that I think most of us know we should do, but can be very troubling when it comes to seeing students who sometimes say things that we find troubling or offensive. And one of the ways that I get around that is listed here in number 5. When I require some sort of reflection assignment or when we're engaging in a reflection exercise, I will often incorporate an objective foundation. So instead of saying, how do you feel about this topic? I will ask instead, how does the evidence for this particular event, thing, phenomenon influence or inform your attitude? So that I've always got something again stable that the students must refer to, and they will become more accustomed to building their critical thinking skills in light of that more objective or solid type of foundation, and hopefully to model that further in other things that they do. This is a big one, and I want to admit that I don't know that I don't have the corner on the market on this one. I also want to thank the wonderful Avila faculty who heard an earlier version of this presentation for some excellent feedback about this particular matter. I don't think that there's a right or wrong way to approach this, but I do want to tell you why I have made some of the decisions that I have in the classroom about sharing features of my identity. So technique number 4 is consider how your own identity might impact the message. When your identity is not visible, but is still related to the material, think through the pros and cons of sharing that. Sometimes there are wonderful reasons why you might want to share that material. And I mentioned this in number two, that, that can be a powerful point of storytelling and humanization and empathy building and nuance, which are all lovely and important. But in other cases, sharing your identity can be a distraction, or sharing your identity can cause students to question whether you are, in fact, a person who can be trusted. And so let me give you an example of this. Here is a true story that I never tell my students. I was raised in an extremely strict fundamentalist group where women could not speak publicly in religious services. And I mean, it was strict, strict, strict. In the summer, I went to a summer camp. I could not wear shorts. My sister had to be sent home one summer because she got heat stroke. I mean, we're talking like, very, very fundamentalist. And interestingly, anti-Catholic. Now, I don't tell them that story. I don't tell them that the reason why I have an interest in religion and gender is probably clearly because of that background, right? I don't tell them that the reason why I study the impact of evangelical groups on sex, gender, and reproduction rhetoric is because of my own experience, although it's clearly quite autobiographical, right? But the reason I don't do that is because that, I believe, is a distraction for students. It becomes something that keeps them from thinking about the larger critical thinking principles that I'm trying to impart. In other circumstances and for other people, that tool could be used very powerfully. For me, it's not a good choice. Part of it is my discomfort with sharing that with a group of 18 and 19-year-olds, right? And with sort of navigating the questions that might come from that. In other cases, I think, and I know, based on some of the student populations that we teach, that I very likely have students in the class who ascribe to some of those ideas. And the fact that they might see me as a person who stands apart from them or who has left them might cause them to question the integrity of my analysis. So again, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. But I do think that when you're thinking about your own identity in the classroom, that you really should consider all of the different repercussions, but also the powerful intonations that can occur from sharing that. One of the things that I am, number three, very careful about is that when I am talking about the experiences of individuals, I am very, very careful. Actually, like Mary was just talking about, that I do not refer to the behaviors, the beliefs, the food practices of a group of people, right? That I really try to nuance as much as possible, that I provide a lot of different examples of individuals who may actually defy stereotypes so that the students can see that humans are actually way more complicated than they may appear on the surface. And then finally, when we're talking about really sticky topics, I will often not say, well, I think, in fact, I rarely take a position in these classes. And I tell the students at the outset that I will not necessarily share my positions with them. It does help if we are talking out here about what the experts think. And if we can talk about the range of experts, it helps to, I think, take some of that tension that might exist in the class and to defer or to offload it to other people so that we can have the sense of standing on the sideline as observers and perhaps wading into that conversation a little bit more gently rather than the students feeling like I'm telling them what to think. So for that reason, there are some things about my personal experiences that are totally pertinent, but I don't share them. And again, that's a personal call. However, I am very careful based on the power dynamics in the class that I don't share with students any personal political positions. The only ethical positions that I actively take up are the CSJ values, and I describe them in that very clear way. And since we are a CSJ institution, that is very rarely something that I have trouble with in terms of student receptivity. And finally, practice preventative de-escalation. This is a thing. This requires actual practice. I practice this with my own biological children to greater or lesser degrees of success. When you are in a class with your students, or when you are in a very thorny conversation with someone else, One of the things that we know causes the conversation to escalate is if you, in fact, look like you are escalating, if you are turning colors, if you are making faces, if you, in your attempt to respond, are attempting to interrupt, right? That urgency will create the feeling amongst those that you are teaching or those with whom you're speaking that you're attempting to do this to each other, that we are now in a communicative battle. So I try a technique that I call the intentional pause. And when I'm in a thorny conversation with students, or if a student has said something that's offensive and there's kind of a moment in the class where everyone turns to me to see what I'm going to do, I do not jump on the student. I do think to myself, downbeat. And then I, as cool as I can, respond to the student as if they had, asked me, do you prefer tea or lemonade? That sort of demeanor can, and again, I think it has to be practiced, is something that can really help folks take control. Many of us are probably familiar with kind of the mirror effect, where whatever type of emotion that we show is often then mirrored on others around us. So I know in the classroom that if I keep things calm and cool, that the students will tend to reflect that same sort of tone. I strongly encourage you to practice a response for if a student says something, both what you might publicly say and then what you might privately say. Also, be sure that you are thinking about the difference between someone who has accidentally been offensive and someone who has intentionally been offensive. That is probably a very long and different conversation for another day. But suffice it to say that one of the most important things in the classroom publicly is not to shame the person. I really stand by, simply saying something fairly short and sweet, which is, I'm not sure that that way of approaching this situation is helpful or respectful. So let's move on here. And it's done. And then if I need to follow up with them, and I often do, to talk about what went down, then that's something that I will do. We have students all the time who might accidentally say something offensive, who might accidentally harm others. And there are ways to resolve that lovingly and constructively. I often say something like, I understand why you might think that. That's a really common stereotype. The reality is that things are really more complicated. So why do you think that we often assume this? And so addressing things like that in a very head-on way can be helpful. In that same spirit, I focus on critiquing types of arguments. I do not critique people. So I hope it goes without saying that we would never, call students or our colleagues dumb, insensitive, these sorts of things. When we do that, even if a person behaved that way, they will literally shut down. They won't be able to hear the type of commentary that we're making. And so I'm very careful to critique, again, the arguments that they're making. And then finally, one of the most important things that I really try to do is to reinforce the rationality of the audience. I think one of the things that is so challenging for all of us is looking what we think is dumb in front of other people or looking like we're wrong. It's one of the reasons why students say that they don't talk to us, right? I'm afraid to be wrong. And so if I can constantly help them to understand, if I can help them to see by saying, I understand where you're coming from. I understand how you've been taught this thing. I understand why that might seem rational. But in light of this new information we've got, in light of this new data that we've got, how should we respond now? And that way of kind of baby stepping the conversation is much more successful in bringing students to a place where we can have an effective conversation rather than just simply saying, that's wrong, or I will not tolerate that in this class, or, I don't know what fools would say something like that, because that's immediately going to cause those barriers to go up. Hearing goes away, listening goes away. And then not only are we right back where we started, but oftentimes we're in an even worse place than we were before. So those are my techniques. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen and to participate in this. Let me stop sharing. hopefully we're all back together now.
Leslie, I want to thank you for the wonderful, wonderful presentation. I can't think of a better way to end the day other than talking about the CSJ values in the classroom. So bravo. And I will say I'm honored because I get to see Leslie put a lot of these techniques into action almost every day. Um, we have a few minutes remaining. I'd love to get to some questions that you might have before I turn it over to Martha. Here we have a question, Leslie. When you provide the CSJ approach as the context for decision making or assessments, do you share that within the CSJ communities that there may be similar polarities as in larger societies?
Yes, definitely. One of the things that I think can be so damaging to us is to think that we are somehow living outside of society, that we somehow are immune to, to culture. And I try to be very clear to students that when we are critiquing certain types of cultural phenomena, or when we have certain types of ethical concerns, that we are just as likely to polarize, that we're just as likely to make snap judgments as anyone else is. One of the things that I really enjoy about Donna Hicks is there was an interview with Donna Hicks, who wrote the Dignity book, and Hicks has a great moment in one of these interviews where she talks about how much she struggles to live out the principles in her own book. And that is such a catalyzing comment for me, I think, because what it means is that we will, none of us will be perfect, but it is the hope that we can all become better. So yeah, these same dynamics exist everywhere. This is, I don't know, not to nerd out on it, but like this is just sociology, right? Like humans do these things in groups. But perhaps to oversimplify it, what we can do through the power of ethics is to analyze ourselves and ask how we can maximize the sorts of values that we want to live by. And that comes through those different types of creative thinking and critical thinking too.
Leslie, if you don't mind, I may put you on the spot. Could you talk a little bit about the connectivity with the difficult discussions, difficult conversations, and then your work with the Dignity Book Club? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. Um, the reason why I came to the Dignity Book Club, or developed the Dignity Book Club, I should say, is because I first became interested in that topic whenever I was taking some conflict resolution courses with a local organization that specializes in conflict resolution. And they were using, in a restorative justice context, they were using that book as a way help to help incarcerated men find a new word other than respect. And what they were finding is that in the context of the prison, that when someone would physically, harm another person, when one inmate would have an altercation with another, that oftentimes the rationale that one of the men would use is that, well, he didn't show me respect, right? And so the reason why they adopted this dignity mindset is because they wanted to reinforce that all people have worth and that someone doesn't have to, in kind of a transactional bartering way, someone doesn't have to give you respect for them to have to, for you to offer it back to them. And so I was really struck by the lessons of that book, and particularly some of the areas that I think are probably the most important in organizations and also in families, in our personal relationships. One of the principles that I think, at least for me, can be the most difficult in terms of valuing the dignity of others is giving them the benefit of the doubt. And so as we have been, so that's one of the 10 principles of dignity that Hicks talks about. And we did a faculty book club over the Dignity book last semester. And then this semester, we've got a mixed group of faculty and staff who are gathering together over lunch to talk about how we might use these dignity principles to change the way that we interact with each other, to change the way that we treat our students, And also, it's turned a little bit into therapy too. I think some of our participants in the past have said, "Wow, this really reminds me of marriage therapy." Like, yeah, there's some parallels. So, um, this is, I approach the Dignity book as a very kind of universal platform, a more secular platform for how to think about right relationships. And so that's one of the reasons why I like it so much and why I thought that it was appropriate for us to look at it in the context of being a CSJ school, is that we really can't understand how to serve with the dear neighbor, and we can't understand, right relationships, unifying love. What do these things mean? Again, if we don't want to turn, our interactions into an amorphous, grouping of kind of like buzzwords, then what do these words mean whenever we implement them in our culture? And so that's why I found this book so powerful, is that it gives some very, very specific ideas on how to treat other people and can be used in a very practical way. And a lot of the tips that I gave in this presentation are actually inspired by some of the techniques in that book.
Very good. We have one comment. Let's see. I think it seems like a discussion of what the term valid means might also be helpful in this context. As a mathematician, for example, I recognize the difference between something being valid and something being sound. So I think that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, and without getting too much in, how, like in an intro ethics course, how we might use conversations about the soundness of an argument and the logic of an argument. One of the things that, I will often use a ridiculous argument, like I said earlier, that we should kill off a bunch of people in order to have more stuff for the rest of us. That is logical if your goal is more stuff for fewer people, right? It is also objectively true that will happen. But I think that it's very important for students to understand that as CSJ institutions, that we have these ethical guardrails that really, as a display of our charism, have a really type of universal appeal to people, because they are very much about the dignity that all of us yearn for. And so in an ethics class, if I'm just teaching kind of an intro to ethics class, there are various ways that we might approach those types of arguments. But I think one of the benefits that we have as a CSJ institution is that we actually have something to point to that can help us know that this is the standard by which we will define for our community what is appropriate, what makes sense for us. I think that is also another factor in how students often think, that everyone's opinion is equally valid, is because they say, well, it's just what you think is logical or just what you think is objective. Well, that's usually not the case whenever we're talking about these things happening in real life. There are some pretty fundamental human needs that everyone needs to have fulfilled, and there are various types of experiences that almost no human wants to have. And so when we can sort of return to that conversation, and we can talk about how our own institutional framework inspires what we talk about, I find that that is a great buffer for some of the controversy that can otherwise crop up, because my sense is that students are really looking for that type of solidity. They're looking for something solid and strong and reliable. I was just thinking when Mary was talking about how that it's the unifying love, it's the capacity for love that has kept her able to to continue to do this job despite the difficulties of academia, of leadership. I can relate to that on a really deep level. Even if everything is topsy-turvy, if everything is frightening, I never have to question whether these values make sense and whether they are good for people. They simply are. And they check so many boxes from even an academic ethics perspective that if we can start from that foundational place, then we've suddenly got a language through which to talk students through some of these thorny issues that other institutions may not.
I cannot think of a better way to end the day. Thank you very much, Leslie, for the wonderful presentation. Um,
Thank you.
all right, Martha, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thank you, Leslie, for your presentation and really giving us some more tools in navigating hard conversations and leading in and living the charism too. We've heard from 3 great speakers and presentations today, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow. We have 2 presentations tomorrow. The first with Sister Mary McGlone, How Did We Get Here and Why? A history of the Sisters of St. Joseph and their work in higher education. And then the second presentation by Suzanne Del Gizzo, transactional versus transformation education, realizing the promise of a mission-driven core curriculum. So more to come. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.